Hi everyone, it's Olga from Olga's Flavor Factory, and today I'm going to show you how to make the most amazing orange scones. You don't need any fancy equipment or special skills. You don't even need a mixer. All you need is a bowl, some very simple ingredients, and I'll share a few really cool tips that will give you the perfect scones every time. Tender and really flaky with a nice golden exterior and the most amazing orangey glaze on top. Like most of my baking recipes, the ingredients that you need for scones are also very simple. You probably have them in your pantry. The only thing I usually need to pick up is an orange, because we're going to be making orange scones. So we are going to need both the zest, which is the outside of the orange peel, and the orange juice. So we're going to add that to both the scones and the glaze that's going to go on top of the scones later. I always start with the dry ingredients first. So we have all-purpose flour and some granulated sugar. We're going to put that into the mixing bowl first, and also add in some baking soda, baking powder, a little bit of salt. And then we'll do the liquid ingredients, which are butter, and we're going to use frozen butter, and then also some melted butter, but that is going to be brushed on top of the scones later, right before we bake them. Then we're going to use some sour cream and milk. I'm using whole milk, and a little bit of vanilla. And that's it for the scones. The glaze is really simple. We're just gonna need the powdered sugar and also a little bit of liquid to loosen it up. So we're gonna use a little bit of milk and also more orange juice and more orange zest, just so that it gives it a lot of orange flavor all the way through. Before you get started making the scone dough, preheat your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we're gonna move on to the rest of the ingredients. This is really important. You need to keep all the ingredients really, really cold. If they're not cold, you're not gonna get the correct texture. The scones are not gonna be as tender and light. So we're gonna put the butter in the freezer before you even start. So it needs to be frozen solid, so it's as cold as possible. And the next thing is we're going to mix the milk and the sour cream together, and I'm gonna put that into the refrigerator so it stays really cold. That way the liquid ingredients are gonna stay really cold while we're mixing the dry ingredients together. We just don't want them to come to room temperature, so if you take out your ingredients beforehand, don't take out the dairy. Keep that in the fridge until the very last minute, or mix it up and keep it in your fridge. I got a liquid measuring cup because this is going to be the easiest way to then later pour everything into the batter. So we've got the milk, the sour cream. You could also use buttermilk. That will work as well, but I usually have sour cream, so this works for me. And then just whisk it together until it's nice and smooth. Next, I'm going to zest the orange. And you want to do this first because it's going to be really hard to get any orange zest off if you juice it first. I do half of the orange into the liquid ingredients for the scone dough, and then I do the other half for the glaze that we're going to put on top of the scones. So I'm actually going to do this right now. Set this aside for a second. And I'm going to put the rest of the orange zest into this bowl, which we're going to use for the glaze later. And all of the aroma and the flavor of the citrus is in the rind, which makes it so flavorful, aromatic. It's just magical. If you don't add the orange zest, it actually will not taste like oranges, even if you use the orange juice. We're gonna need 2 tablespoons of orange juice to go in the glaze and also into the scone batter. And if your orange is not very juicy, you can use orange juice from the bottle from the store. That'll work as well. Or you can also use a little bit more milk. Now get this into the refrigerator or even put it in the freezer for a few minutes so it's extra cold. Put all of your dry ingredients into this big bowl, the sugar. Then add the baking powder, baking soda, and salt. Mix everything up so it's evenly distributed. And now we're going to take this frozen stick of butter and grate it right into the flour. Grate the butter very quickly so that it doesn't start melting on you. And also I like to keep coating it in the flour while I'm grating it so those butter flakes stay separate and they're not all clumped together. Don't overwork the dough. Get it to the point where it just all comes together. If some of the flour isn't mixed in completely, that's totally fine. And now we're going to sprinkle some flour on the counter and put the dough right on top of the flour. Now the dough is going to be a little bit sticky and a little wet. So what I like to do is to sprinkle some more flour right on top of it as well. Kind of coat it in the flour more. So get all that dough on there. And if you need to, you might want to add a little bit more flour if it's too sticky, but don't add too much because it'll be too tough. So the trick to this is to not overwork it when you're mixing, not overwork it when you're rolling it out. So just be gentle with it. Put lots of flour on top, kind of flatten it out with your hand. And don't worry, the excess flour, we'll get rid of it later, but you need a lot of it so that it doesn't stick to the counter. And use a rolling pin and just roll it out very gently until it's about a 12-inch square. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to get your ruler out. So like this, I like to pick it up and make sure that it's not sticking. Add a little more flour under there, like that, and keep rolling it out. That looks about right. A little bit more this way. So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna fold it over like a business letter into thirds like this. And if it's sticking on the bottom, just lift it up lightly, fold it over on top so that it looks like this. And now get a dinner plate or anything just to hold the dough and put it on there. And we're gonna put it in the freezer for 5 minutes. If you don't do this part and you just roll out the scones once, cut them into triangles, they will be much flatter and denser. So this part is kind of like a very quick version of a puff pastry. When you roll out the dough, you put butter in there, roll it out again, and you do this multiple times, chilling it in between. This makes sure the butter stays cold, it gets distributed between different layers of dough, and you get those flaky, wonderful layers. So this is obviously a very, very quick version of this, but it does help a lot to create those layers in the scones, to keep everything really cold, and you're just gonna be amazed at how tender these scones are. And like I said multiple times, it's really important to keep the dough really cold so the butter doesn't melt. And if the dough is not as cold as it should be and it gets a little bit too warm, the scones are gonna spread out and flatten out when they're baking. When you take the dough out of the freezer, put it on the floured countertop and roll it out into a 12-inch square again. This time, instead of folding it into thirds, roll it up as tightly as you can and then shape it into a log about 12 inches by 4 inches. To form it into scones, we're gonna cut this rectangle in half and then in half again. And then we're gonna cut these pieces on the diagonal so we have triangles. And that's it. You've got yourself some scones. All you have to do is bake them. Just get them onto a cookie sheet, line it with some parchment paper first, and get them into the oven. And this process has to be super fast so that everything stays cold. You can also make the scones in advance and then put them in the fridge, keep them nice and cold, and when you're ready to bake them, get them into the oven. Brush the top of the scones with melted butter and put them in the preheated oven to bake. Bake the scones in the oven for about 15 to 20 minutes. Now this really depends on your oven. Some ovens are not very accurate, and because it's such a high temperature, you really want to watch them. So if your oven heats up really quickly and maybe it's a little higher than it should be, then watch them because they may be ready in like 12 minutes because it's such a high temperature. Take the scones out of the oven, and then I like to let them rest on the baking sheet for about 5 minutes, and then I transfer them to a rack so that they cool off. And while they're cooling off, you can make the glaze. Wait for the scones to cool off until they're slightly warm before you put the glaze on top. If they're too hot, the glaze is gonna melt right into the top of the scones and you're not gonna get that beautiful white glaze topping. Remember, we saved that orange zest and orange juice in this bowl from earlier. We're gonna use that to make the glaze right now. So I'm gonna add the powdered sugar right in here and we're gonna whisk it together. Add another spoonful or two of milk and keep whisking. It might seem like it's not gonna come together, but it will. And if it's still too thick, you can add a little bit more orange juice or a little bit more milk because you want to be able to drizzle it on top of the scones. This looks perfect. This is a really good consistency for glaze because it'll spread out evenly. And you can either drizzle it on top right with the whisk, get a spoon and spread it out, or even a pastry brush, whichever way that you want to. You can even pick it up, kind of disperse it all over the surface. That way you don't get too much glaze on there and you're not wasting as much. If you put too much on top, it'll spread out better, but then you're gonna waste a lot of glaze. So this way, kind of help it to spread out. Another way that you can glaze the scones is to place the glaze inside a Ziploc bag, snip off a corner, and drizzle the glaze on the scones that way. The scones look so pretty when you glaze them this way. You waste a lot less of the glaze, and there's a much thinner layer of the glaze on the scones too. The scones are so soft in the center, and you definitely get that flakiness from that frozen butter. And they are nice and golden on the exterior, which is awesome. It's absolutely brimming with orange flavor in the actual scone, and then on the glaze as well. They're not too sweet and just the perfect treat to go with your coffee in the morning. You could also switch up the different flavors, and one of my favorites is to use lemon instead of orange and add some blueberries. Blueberry scones are probably my #1 favorite, followed closely by these orange ones. I love that I can make this anywhere at anybody's house, and I don't need a mixer. If somebody doesn't have a rolling pin, I've used wine bottles before or just patted it out with my hands. It's so easy, and then it's such a treat for everybody to enjoy. Go to Olga's Flavor Factory to get the printable recipe and try this recipe for yourself. You're gonna be amazed how simple it is to put it all together. I forgot to add something, but you know what? These scones are kind of big. So what I often like to do is to cut them in half. When you're cutting them into 8 triangles, you can easily cut them in half, and that way you'll get 16 smaller scones. If you have kids or you just don't want to have these big scones, the 16 smaller ones are awesome.